Recently, the Industry Center had its annual summer encampment. There, the center featured on Ott down with his old Ken Burns, producer-director of the Civil War. The series Newsweek magazine called Video Miracle.
Before we get into the Civil War, I'd like to touch on the subjects. When we first met, you had just finished the Brooklyn Bridge. We were starting on the Shakers, and since that time, it's been Huey Long and the Congress and so on. How do you go about choosing those topics?
It's a very personal process. It's mostly when the bells go off inside and you're told that this is real history, and history doesn't have interest for me unless it's emotional about it, then towards it. Each one of these stories defined moment in American history. Here's the Brooklyn Bridge, Huey Long. Like Blake, who said you could see the universe in a grain of sand, you can see all of American history in these moments. And strangely, each one of these little grains of sand was touched by the Civil War, so that finally, after the Congress, Thomas Hart Benton, as well as the Statue of Liberty and the other titles we've talked about, it became really clear that if I'm going to be called an American history filmmaker, we have to do the Civil War, try to understand it. This was our defining moment as a country.
That was the question I wanted to ask, is why the series? Because I think that's important, but there also seems to be a lot in the way of timing. You know, it's the 120th anniversary of this battle and that battle. There are movies being made like Glory and others coming out all the time. And did that have anything to do with, you know, giving you some direction? I mean, because you're also into making money.
It didn't really at the beginning. There was no sense that we were setting off for anniversaries. But I remember something that Lewis Mumford said to me when I was working on the Brooklyn Bridge project. He was, of course, the great social critic who recently died. He said that each generation rediscovers and remakes some part of its past because that part of its past has particular meaning for the present. I think we're in a period in which the Civil War can really dramatically tell us not about what just happened back then, but what is happening now and how to proceed from that.
Ken, how do you go about the research for such a monumental task? When I think of the holdings of the Atlantic History Center in our library, and I remember a reference in the film in one clip there to almost 1 million images taken, and many of those lost. And then I think of just the number of museums, the number of historians and people writing about it. I mean, where do you begin to kind of factor all this material into something that comes out as a whole and understandable?
Well, we're supposed to be in a very glamorous business, this movie-making thing, and it's not. We felt very much like archivists. We shot over 150 hours of film, 16,000 old photographs. We used 3,000 of them from 160 different archives. The basic thing is that we didn't want the research to ever end. We wanted always, up to the last minute of the production, to be influenced by what happened, and not go into it with the assumption that we knew what happened back then, but to use the process of filmmaking as a process of discovery. And I'm very pleased to say that on the last day of editing, we actually added a scene. We discovered a quote in an old photograph, and we put them together and actually made a nice scene. Frederick Douglass commenting on the slowness towards emancipation. For us, the research is it, and we don't assign it to a legion of researchers. We do it ourselves. I wish to see each photograph that I'm either going to use or reject for this thing. The most startling image I know is that this country, very much like Vietnam for us, was obsessed with the photography during the war. It was the living room war after Matthew Brady and the other great photographers got started. But after the war, the appetite for photography fell off completely. And in fact, most of the glass plate negatives were lost, mislaid, forgotten. And the most poignant image I know from the war is that they eventually were sold, some of these glass plate negatives, to gardeners, not for their images, but for the glass itself as replacement panes in greenhouses. And can you imagine that the image of war is being burned off countless greenhouses from around the country as the nation really sought to forget and put distance between themselves and the carnage, the memory that they had murdered 620,000 of their own young men.
Do you feel that we really have lost a great portion of the visual image of the war? I mean, I have no idea how many photographers were working, but there must have been literally hundreds. And in addition to photographers, you have the illustrators.
Yes.
What happened to the body of that work? I mean, is it truly gone, or are they still in repositories around this country yet to be discovered?
I think there's a lot that's available, and I'm pleased to say that we don't have, by any means, a complete record of the war, but tens of thousands of photographs do exist, and hundreds of thousands of some of these drawings and lithographs. There is a great sense of loss, particularly the loss of the southern side. Mary Chesnut, the great diarist, comments very late in the series as the inevitable defeat is closing in around her. She said, everything is lost, even everything on our horizon is lost, even our archives. And it just occurred to me that for her, the archives meant something back in 1865 to her. And the idea that the Southern way of life, that the Southern culture, that what actually happened would be kept from future generations was a tragedy to her, and must be, in a way, a tragedy to us.
Yeah. The other question I have to ask, that you've handled so masterfully, is the choice and selection of commentators, historians, and writers. And I think there are probably two that really hit home. Number one is Shelby Foote. When I look at Shelby Foote and I see that gray beard, and I think of myself, maybe how I got this job, I also see Robert E. Lee in that same face for the Southern writer, historian, general. And then I think of, Barbara Fields, the black historian at the end. And then I look at the face of some of the women that show up. I mean, do you see a continuity there between these people and the past?
Yes, it's one of the magic dividends of the business I'm in. We had originally thought that we would film 36 historians who would make pronouncements on the Civil War, but after filming Shelby and Barbara Fields, we were struck by how much they spoke from their hearts about this extraordinary event, and really were there in a way. Shelby in his just sheer mastery of the events of the Civil War, and Barbara in her understanding of how the war brings its meaning to our doorstep even today. And those two passions, very different, one male, one female, one northern, one southern, one black, one white, help to really give, I think, an extraordinary, almost spiritual balance to the film, and remind us of the issues, whether there's Shelby, who seems to be present at every battle, or Barbara, who reminds us it isn't just the battle. Together they help us get through it, and required that we didn't need to go to those 36 others to get the story of the war.
You've got one common narrator through it all, David McCullough.
Yes.
And this isn't the first time that David's appeared in your film. What is it about David? Is it the northern perspective, or just he as a historian, or is it more the voice and his own understanding of history?
It's all of those things, and I'm glad you said that. David has been the narrator in nearly all of my films, all but one. We originally approached him for the Brooklyn Bridge because he'd written the definitive history of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I insisted, despite the objections of everyone involved, that a historian should be the narrator, especially a historian that knew the subject. McCullough brings his phenomenal voice. It is both unobtrusive and invisible, and at the same time, you never forget it. He's your guide. He's your help throughout. Being a historian, he knows the subject so that he can inhabit the words. He's not doing a dramatic reading. He knows what he is talking about. And the narration, written beautifully, I believe, by our principal writer, Jeff Ward, the two of them have delivered a sterling narrative. And then, of course, it's the fact that his voice has that timbre that can help you connect. And by the end, you miss him going. And what's nice is that Shelby, being the southern voice, and David being a northern voice, help to balance one another out. And it's great. We set out insisting that there be no true judgments in this film, that we not be analytical, that we not take sides, that there be no villains. And in fact, the only villain we have in this film, with the possible exception of George McClellan, who is excruciatingly slow and drives Lincoln nuts as a Union general, is the institution of slavery. That is the villain in this show. Besides that, there are no villains. And having it balanced this way, I think, is very helpful. So often, histories are written by the victors and the vanquished to feel a sense of oppression in the way history is written. We hope that Southerners as well as Northerners, black as well as white, can take a great deal of comfort in this film and the story, our exposition of what happened, because we're interested finally first in what happened.
Yeah. Well, there's an artful use of music throughout, and sound effects, I guess, if you will, of artillery barrages and crowds and applause. Is that hard to introduce and make it effective without either overpowering or undermining what you're trying to do?
Exactly. You've described, in some ways, one of the principal razor's edge that we have to be on in the editing of a film. You do not want to be too much, you don't want to be too less. Music is often added at the end of every film. You finish editing and then you score it. We don't do it that way. We think music is as important an element as the old photograph. And so I recorded the music with no concern about how long it should be, very early on in the process, and sometimes edited scenes to the music rather than the other way around. And that's why it feels organic. It's authentic music. Same with the sound effects. We wish to make these old photographs come alive. We didn't think of them as dusty old archives, evidence of the past, but as live scenes. And so what is this live scene? A wide shot of troops, a medium shot, a close-up. We wanted to know what it sounded like, what birds were chirping then, what the cicadas sounded like, what the sound of 100 muskets going off, or 100 parrot guns going off. So we researched those, and we built a sound effects track that is as complicated as any feature film. And one of the things I think that helps in these really minute moments where the past comes alive, where all of a sudden you're not looking from the safe position of the present back at this ancient event, but that you're looking at an event that is happening.
Well, what a lead-in you've just given me, bringing history to life, because just what the motto was saying to the New Atlanta History Fest, just that. And my feeling is that that's what makes history so fascinating, is taking it from the dull, dusty book, taking it from just a flat image, and bringing something out of it that just captivates the imagination. What you've done in the film is also to take an image and translate it into a modern-day vista of a river, a scene, a city. And that's a very effective tool. I mean, is that something you do consciously? I remember in the Sacred movie, the capturing of light on buildings and building materials just made a statement that couldn't be beat. You've done that in the Civil War. I mean, but it's got to be extremely difficult.
We forget that the word history is mostly made up of the word story. If we tell stories, we're not going to lose our audience. My goodness, we're in a country now that thinks that history is some terrible medicine that we have to take. And you and I know that it's perhaps the best tonic there possibly can be. Yes, we have to learn to tell our stories one to another, to make it come alive, because if we don't know where we've been as a people, we can't possibly know where we're going. And if we don't know this Civil War story and what happened, we have to think of the life of the country in the same way we think of the life of a human being. The Civil War was a great traumatic shock in the middle of our childhood that still influences us today. And we have to psychoanalyze it. We have to find out where we were back then and learn the stories, the tragic and the profound ones, the happy and the sad ones. And the Civil War is not without that. I'm reminded of one where both Union and Confederate soldiers in the cold winter of 1863, very rainy, muddy season, were stationed, both of them, near the Duck River in Tullahoma, Tennessee. And one soldier from one army wrote back and said that he was in Tullahoma, from the Greek word tulla, meaning mud, and homa, meaning more mud. And I've never forgotten that in the midst of this terrible, terrible near-national suicide, that there could be that kind of humor.
You've got 4 years of the war, 1861 through 64. I want to talk a little bit about Atlanta, but I want you to just briefly tell us, if you look at 1861 and then you look at 1862 and 1863, is there one event in each of those years that just captured your imagination?
Well, yes, I think in actually the 5 years of the war and the 5 evenings we're going to see, 61 is about how, disguise it as anyone wants to make it, this institution called slavery, in a country that had established itself 85 years before to be where all men were created equal, had to remove the inconsistency. And unfortunately, it resulted in this terrible, terrible conflict. And there was this exuberance that this country rushed off to war without any sense of the killing that was about to begin. If 1861 is about anything, it's about this blind fury, the rush towards war, the rush to embrace it, and then to be brought up short in the tragic consequences of the first battles that happened. 62 has one story, really. As Southern victories mount, brilliant Southern victories mount, Lincoln must come to grips with the issue. Is this war about union, which he insists at the beginning it is, or about emancipation, which he has tried desperately politically to hold off the decision? So the issue of emancipation diffuses the year 1862. 1863, one of the episodes in that we call the Universe of Battle. I can't think of a better name for what 63 is about. It is about glorious Southern victories and glorious Southern defeats. It's about Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee's finest hour, about Gettysburg, about Chattanooga. It is about fighting, the all-out warfare. 64 is in some ways the saddest year of the war. It should be over. The decisive battle, so to speak, has happened, and yet there are a dozen more decisive battles to come. The war changes character and becomes a kind of rehearsal for World War I. The casualties increase. The gentlemanly Napoleonic War of the first couple of years is fading away. Hospital casualties and deaths mount tremendously. It's a very difficult war. It sees the fall of Atlanta in it. And finally, 1865, the last year, is when we begin to come to grasp with the terrible paradox of the war and its meaning, that in order to become one nation, we tore ourselves in two. And there's a very simple idea that comes out of this. Before the war, we said the United States are. We referred to ourselves as a collection of estates, a union, plural. After the war, we began using the idea of a word nation came into our talk, and we said the United States is, singular, in fact, ungrammatical. And that's what this war did. It made us an is. So in the last episode, there's a sense of a kind of coming together, a unification despite great divisions.
Well, let's go back to 1864 and talk about the Atlantic campaign a bit. Do you see it as a turning point for the Confederacy? Joseph E. Brown, our governor, described the loss of Atlanta to the Confederacy like a man losing his heart. And do you think that's true? I mean, was it such a turning point?
Without a doubt. It may be the single most important reason for the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. All that summer of 1864, his re-election was in grave doubt. It was the fall of Atlanta that brought really the first significant good news for the North that year. It broke the back of the South. There's a huge symbolism in this, too. Grant had been leading the Western armies, had done well at Chattanooga, and Lincoln had brought him east to take care of the bumbling, fumbling Army of the Potomac and put Sherman, a master strategist. You know, the South has heaped so much opprobrium on Sherman that they've obscured him as an important figure in the war. He's just been seen as brutal. What he was terribly modern. He was such a superb strategist that he knew that in order to win the war, he had to wage war on the countryside, on property. Up to this point, the Civil War two armies had been fighting. Now Sherman said, I wish to wage war on what would support those armies. And he did so effectively that he, more than anything else, more than the Eastern battles in Virginia, brought it to its crux. The symbolic victories and defeats are with Grant and Lee, but the tactical, strategic deciding points in the war come in the Western campaigns. It's unusual to think of Georgia being in the West, but the armies that had fought in Kentucky and Tennessee were the Western armies, and they invaded Georgia, sweeping down from Chattanooga, and the rest, as you all know, is history, terribly poignant, tragic history, but very much the turning point, where the end was really clear at that point.
Well, I'd love William Tecumseh Sherman. I think he really is a strategist. And at the same time, I have tremendous, tremendous admiration for Joseph E. Johnston.
Oh, yes.
I mean, because he was a light commander, a strategist who cared about his men, who knew how to wage war and fought a good war. And yet, somehow he found himself embroiled in a political conflict with, you know, Jefferson Davis and Bragg that really, I think, was his undoing. Do you think, had he been left in command, and I don't want to get into what ifs, but, you know, John Bell Hood was not the commander by any stretch of the imagination. No. Would it have been different had Johnson remained in command?
I agree with you. Joe Johnston is a really, truly great general and unfortunately had to suffer with a lot of political interference. I don't believe, though, ultimately he would have done anything more than delay the inevitable of Sherman's assault on Georgia. Sherman was delighted, of course, when Hood was put in charge. Even Lee was unhappy with Hood. He said, Hood is a bold fighter. I am doubtful as to other qualities necessary. And coming from Robert E. Lee, that's pretty stern criticism. Hood was over-anxious for a fight, and Sherman was happy to give it to him and really destroyed most of his army. By the time that Joe Johnston inherited it, he could only be a sort of a fly buzzing around the side of this gigantic, huge army that was Sherman marching towards the sea. The people described it as a moving city.
Well, there was one statement made in the movie that I remember that related to Nathan Bedford Forrest, and it came out in some of the research that I was doing that had Johnson been able to get Davis to commit Forrest's cavalry, that there was one chance that they could have easily maybe cut off Sherman or slowed him down. Shelby Foote has a fascination with, you know, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And we just talk about him just briefly, because is he as a dynamic, a strategist, and as tough a soldier as you let on?
We have the phrase, get there firstest with the mostest. That's Nathan Bedford Forrest. Shelby Foote, our principal on-camera interview, thinks he is one of the most extraordinary men. He, along with Abraham Lincoln, Foote thinks, that the two most extraordinary individuals that the Civil War produced. Forrest is a wonder. He shot 30 men in hand-to-hand combat and had 31 horses shot out from under him. And he said at the end of the war, I was a horse ahead. He was just an unbelievable guy. He rose from private to major general, the highest that anyone ever went, the farthest that anyone ever went in the Civil War. And he was a fighting general. He'd lead his men into the middle of a battle, and no matter what the odds were, he'd be there fighting. You cannot say enough about Nathan Bedford Forrest as a military commander. I doubt, though, that he could have done more than drive the South, drive Sherman crazy, which is what he did. Sherman said, this man must be hunted down and killed if it takes everything in the United States Treasury. He survived.
Well, let's quickly look. In looking at the war in Georgia, other than the Battle of Atlanta, are there significant events that took place in the state that, you know, had a telling impact on the war in general?
We treat Georgia as a significant cockpit of the war here. Not only Sherman's march after the fall of Atlanta, but all the events leading up to it as he moves from Chattanooga down towards the city is a breathtakingly dramatic and exciting story. Will he or won't he get there in time to save the re-election of Lincoln, to forestall this hound, Nathan Bedford Forrest, nipping at his heels? Of course, the other and an extremely tragic story of Georgia is Andersonville. At some point when the march had moved out of Atlanta and had reached, I think it was Milledgeville, some of escapees, emaciated escapees from Andersonville, tottered into the firelight of some of these Union soldiers, and it made their resolve, if that's the right word, on the rest of the march even greater. Ultimately, 13,000 human beings died there and were buried in mass graves, a terrible kind of forerunner of the concentration camps. In fact, the only person ever given any kind of a consequential sentence, and this was death, was the commandant, Henry Wirtz, who went to his death saying he had only followed orders. Again, a eerie foreshadowing of the 20th century events. Georgia is very important to this war in many ways. And Brown, Governor Brown, is a nice person to follow. When it was finally suggested at the end of the war that the South begin to divide up the states' rights, uniforms, and materiel, he was adamant. He maintained that it was states' rights to the end, and in fact, Jefferson Davis said that it was that states' rights that helped kill the Confederacy. The very thing that brought them out was this insistence, hoarding of uniforms when other states were desperate, things like that. Hal Cobb even said when it was suggested that black troops would make good Southern soldiers, he said that if blacks will make good soldiers, then our whole theory of slavery is wrong.
How do you feel about Alexander Stephens as Vice President of the Confederacy? He's another Georgian that we hear a lot about and I think played a fairly significant role, but I'd be interested in your attitude.
I find that he's one of the most interesting characters, and he has the most intriguing set of photographs. This very interesting face, very soft and sensitive. You know, he never got along with Davis. They rarely spoke to each other, and by the end of the war, he'd left, never to return. And one of the great ironies, of course, is that after the war was over, he was back in his old congressional seat as if it had never happened.
It took you 11 hours to capture the Civil War, and I know if it took 11 hours on film to produce it, there are probably another 25 hours of film that weren't included. Are there things that you had to leave out that you just couldn't put in that you'd like to touch on? Because I'd be interested on what you were forced to leave behind.
Film is suited to do many things, but unfortunately a lot of more intellectual things get left out. I would have wished that we could have had more time to do the political back-scene stuff in Washington. A lot of humor is left out. Left to my druthers, I would have done a 20-hour series. There's that much to say about the Civil War. A lot of funny things were left by the way. And lots of things that just sort of amplified moments, little stories and tangents that we wish to put in, mostly Shelby Foote comments that were so magnificent. There are 11 hours on film. There are 139 other hours of footage that we took.